Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us here for tonight's or this morning's or wherever you may be in the world. But thank you for joining us for this event that we've got on today, which is humbly titled Humanity's Greatest Hope: Why Expanding Our Moral Circles is Key to a Better Future. My name's James Kirby. I'm from Brisbane, Australia, and at the University of Queensland, and I'm delighted to be here with you with a wonderful panel, which I'll introduce shortly. But I'd just like to take just a brief moment just to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands in which we're meeting today, wherever that might be in this virtual world, and just pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So welcome to this evening's, or I keep saying this evening because I'm Australia, but welcome to this panel. And I'm delighted to be joined by a world's expert in this space that intersects compassion with moral expansiveness. And this evening I'm joined by, firstly, Dr. Charlie Crimston. She's a social psychologist at the Australian National University. Her research explores the psychology of moral expansion, societal polarization, and the links between trans identity and well-being. Welcome, Charlie.
Thanks, James. Really great to be here. And yeah, no pressure whatsoever. Humanity's greatest hope.
Yeah, we've got the answers here, everyone. Stay tuned. No, I mean, obviously such a critical topic, particularly in today's current circumstances. And also I'd like to introduce Dr. Maddie Wilkes. So Maddie is a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh and PI of the Altruistic Minds Lab. She uses methods in social and developmental psychology to understand barriers to and facilitators of moral behaviour. Maddie does a lot of work, and she also does a lot of work researching these behaviours and attitudes in children, and also towards artificial intelligence and novel food technologies such as cultured meat. So lovely to have you here, Maddie. My goodness, what
Thank
amazing
you very much
topics.
for having me. I'm excited to be here and to chat with you both.
Well, yes. I mean, I guess the first big question really on this topic is, what do we mean by moral expansiveness and moral circles? And Charlie, I think maybe that would be something that you would be most expert in answering.
Yeah, sure. So the moral circle is I guess how all of this started, and it's just essentially a way of conceptualizing those we care about from those that we don't. So those that we feel a sense of moral concern for versus others that we might not. And this could be other humans, it could be non-human animals, it could be elements of the environment. And it's really been a subject that's been explored in philosophy for a long time, at least a few hundred years. But it was really popularized, I guess, by Peter Singer in the 1980s with his book, The Expanding Circle. And in that, he really spoke about how humanity's moral circle has expanded over time and why that might be and where we might be going. And yeah, so, up to that point, it had really just been examined in a philosophical space. And I was really interested in examining it from a psychological perspective. So what would this look like if we actually wanted to measure people's moral boundaries? How would we conceptualize that? So that's where the moral expansiveness scale came about. And with that, we can really measure how far people extend their moral circles. So, to very distant entities or maybe just to close others. And also the depth of that concern. So how strong are these moral ties? And yeah, so with this measure, we can map what people's moral worlds look like, and that tends to produce a pretty standard pattern where people are most concerned about their family, their friends, their in-group. We generally, as adults, seem to care more about humans than non-humans. Sentience matters. We care more about high sentience animals than low sentience animals. And villains are an interesting category because we cast villains out pretty much entirely and generally consider them to be less worthy of moral concern than plants. So that's the general idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary how you could take a concept like the moral circles and operationalize it in a really clever way and measure it. I mean, I when I first read about it and saw that work, Charlie, I was like, oh my goodness, you're so clever with how you worked out this system. I mean, essentially what you're presented with on screen, if we're measuring that someone's, you know, moral expansiveness, is almost like a bullseye target. Do you want to explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, and honestly, it originally came about just with me drawing circles on a board and
Oh, really?
and seeing where that might lead to. So yeah, if you're actually completing the scale, you might have a list of different entities, and you would consider, okay, how much moral concern do I feel for these entities? So if it's a member of your family, you might think, well, I feel a lot of moral concern and a strong sense of moral obligation. So I might place those people at the very center of my moral circle. And as we get further and further away from the center in as this conceptual space, the general idea is we care less and less about the moral worth of these entities. So yeah, kind of folds out from the center, where we get the most moral concern to the least moral concern to those we don't include at all.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you do that, because like you have to click on the screen on the entity from memory, and then you drag them across and drop them either in like the inner circle to show that they're worthy of, like really worthy of your concern and so on. But what's really cool about that is then you can see different entities relative to each other as well. Like that kind of visual kind of representation, I find, you know, a really powerful aspect of the scale. You know, a lot of scales are just like, how much do you care on a scale of 1 to 7? And you kind of just drop them in, and you're almost thinking of each entity independently almost. Whereas when you see it visually on a bullseye like that, you know, you kind of, I remember filling it out, and I think like one of the entities is like, you know, your mother. And it's kind of like, as I went through and did some of the others, I thought, oh, I need to move mum more in. I don't feel like she's in, you know, all of a sudden I'm like having these mind games in my own head about how I'm placing people in the circle. I think it's a very clever design to try to get a sense of how people, you know, they can look at it and see across these entities of, you know, animal life, environmental life, and then the different types of people we encounter or don't encounter in everyday life, where we see them in our kind of visual moral world is really powerful. Maddie, I mean, you've been doing work in this space as well. When did you first stumble into moral expansiveness in the moral circle?
I think my first foray now was about 7 or so years ago. I mean, I should, I guess, preface this by saying I wouldn't be doing any of this work if it wasn't for Charlie. So thank you so much for having created the scale. And actually, some of the first work I did on this was with Charlie. And so Charlie Carey-Neldner, who's a postdoc at UWA, and I developed a scale to measure moral expansiveness in kids. So basically trying to adapt the adult scale to measure children's moral circles. And then since then, I've been continuing work down that path, looking at not so much moral expansiveness generally, but how children morally value a whole range of different beings. And that's been one of the primary focuses of my work for the last few years.
Yeah, that's amazing. We're definitely going to dig into some of that work you're doing with children, because that is really fascinating. Can I ask then, to the both of you, what factors tend to predict bigger moral circles? So when we say bigger moral circles, that means more entities are kind of worthy of our concern versus more sort of, you know, narrower kind of restricted moral circles. To either of you here, is there any kind of key factors that emerge reliably and often?
I guess one kind of meta point in how we think about this is I've done a little bit of work recently where we've been looking at breaking down factors that contribute to moral consideration into target factors and into judge factors. So target factors are factors about the entity. So what is it about a pig or a dog or an artificial entity that make you grant them or not grant them moral consideration? And then you can also think about it as the other side of that is judge factors. So what is it about me or you that shapes our willingness to grant moral consideration to a whole range of different entities? My read of the field, and I mean, Charlie, please correct me if you disagree, or James, is that most of the work has been focused on target factors. So we know a lot about the different kinds of characteristics of different people and animals that make us deny or grant moral consideration to them. But there's actually been a fair bit less. I think you two have done some of the only work really that has looked at those judge level factors.
That's an amazing distinction, I think, between those important elements which lead us to make a decision, I suppose. Charlie, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is such an important distinction. Absolutely. I think in addition to that, I think the way I really conceptualize it and the way I've tried to really go about it, I think I would really separate or to try to examine drivers of moral expansion as well as barriers to moral expansion. So things that tend to push our moral circle out. Compassion, you'd be surprised to hear, is one of the best candidates that we found in really driving moral boundaries out. And certain barriers that we found are things like anxiety and fears that people might have, or even things like practical constraints, like how many resources we have in terms of actually feeling like we can extend concern to others. So yeah, I like to conceptualize it in that way and examine these things from an individual perspective and as well as a group social perspective.
And with the work that's done, probably most with adults, do you find that depending on where you are in the world, those cultural values might shape how we kind of view our expansiveness with these different entities, like how willing we are to go? Like, is it different in sort of your typical sort of Western cultures where there's sometimes more of a focus on that kind of individualistic kind of norm versus other cultures that are very different?
Yeah, I think culture absolutely plays a massive role in this. We have done some research that was led by Kelly Kirkland, who is now back at UQ, looking at moral expansiveness across different countries. We do see variation, and absolutely cultural factors will influence that. Certain groups or entities are maybe highly valued in different cultures. We would see them I guess closer to the center of people's moral circles. But I also think that things like the availability of resources and wealth are also strongly likely to influence these things, because if we're struggling to fulfill our basic needs, then it would make sense that we might struggle to extend moral concern to others in those situations. So yeah, there are a whole bunch of factors that influence it, and culture is definitely one of those.
Yeah, does that play out with children too, Maddie? I mean, that might be a harder thing to pick up on, but I mean, maybe in adulthood, moral expansiveness becomes more kind of fixed, like less malleable, maybe, unless there's something massive that comes in that impacts your basic needs, perhaps. All of a sudden you've had a lot, but then the country's rocked by something. I'm thinking, in war-torn areas, perhaps, or something like where a conflict has started. But in children, I feel like it would be much more malleable. Have you been looking at that, Maddie?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really nice proposal. I think I don't have any good data to say you're right on the malleability stuff, but intuitively it feels right. And what we find when we test kids, so we conducted this first moral expansiveness study with Charlie and with Carrie a few years back, but in more recent years, I've kind of been looking at different kinds of moral consideration for a few different distant entities. And I mean, you'll both probably agree with me here. I find moral consideration for distant entities tends to be where you see a bit more variability. As Charlie was saying, almost everybody cares about their friends and close friends and family. So I think where you're going to see that variability is going to be these, non-human animals, human outgroups, artificial intelligence, things like that. So I've been looking at children's moral concern for these kinds of groups. And I actually didn't start out thinking I was going to kind of do this whole moral circle pitch and look at all these different distant entities. But I ran one study with animals, and then I ran one study with AI, and then I ran one study with distant others. And looking at it all holistically, I was like, hang on, this is kind of all interlinked. So what we find across all of these different studies is that in general, compared to adults, children seem much more willing to grant moral consideration to these different beings. So as an example, we gave children scenarios where they have to trade off human and animal lives. We told them, there's two boats that are sinking. You can choose to save just one. whichever boat you pick, everyone on that boat will be okay. We would never say anything like people on the other boat won't be, because, you know, ethics, but it was implied. And then we told them on one boat there's one person, on the other boat there's, for example, 10 dogs. And we've given them lots of different trade-offs between human and animal lives. And what we generally find is that, for example, adults will choose to save one human life over, you know, 100 dogs or pigs, which is the highest number of animals that we've included in the task, but I think they would go higher. Children, on average, will choose to save 2 dogs or 6 pigs over one person. Now, I should be very clear when I say children. This has mostly been in the United States. We've recently replicated the finding in Poland, but I can't make, you know, universal claims about children all over the world. But in the areas that we've tested, there seems to be this children just don't tend to prioritize humans over animals to the same degree that adults do. We see a similar pattern where young children think that we are obliged to help people, even if those people live really far away or are really different from us. Whereas adults think that we're less obliged to help these people that are different or physically distant from us. And we also see children are more willing to grant moral consideration to artificial entities. So we're just kind of getting this pattern consistently across a whole range of different contexts. And I know there are some collaborators out there who've done other work that has looked at this in the context of family versus strangers as well, for example. And so tentatively, it really does seem like children are more willing to grant moral consideration to these distant entities. And I think in some ways you can conceptualize that as having more expansive moral circles.
How old are these children?
We typically work with kids from around 5 or 6 up to about 10 years of age. We've got a little bit of ongoing work with teenagers at the moment. It's really, really hard to work with teenagers. It's been a big lesson. I kind of thought maybe this work wasn't there, or like maybe I hadn't found the work yet. I wasn't really sure why it wasn't there. And now, having tried to do it, I understand why it's not there. It's been a really, really long, like, you know, two full years of trying to collect this data, but we've actually just finished in the last couple of weeks. So hopefully I'll have some more data now, but it seems like what we're seeing tentatively is a bit of a drop through those teenage years where moral consideration starts to go down.
Yeah. And you see that typically for those outer entities. Do you mean in particular like that really kind of, they really move out, whereas the inner ones of family and friends, they kind of remain stable? Is that kind of...
We haven't been testing so much for the inner categories. We do a little bit in terms of, you know, our comparison between humans and animals, or between like strangers or people that they know, things like that. But mostly what we're focused on is the pattern for these further out entities. But yeah, you're right that children and adults give more similar answers for the closer entities.
Yeah, no, sorry. Sorry for forgetting that. This question comes from Robert, and this is to both of you, perhaps. But, you know, are morals inherent or are they learned? You know, obviously we get asked, you know, that's a big question that comes up for so many different topics like compassion, empathy, as well as obviously this as well. So yes, are morals inherent or are they learned?
I mean, if either of you want to have a go, please feel free, but I'm happy to try and answer this one. I guess
Maddie.
There's not a single answer to this. So there's some research out there suggesting that infants have these kinds of like capacities at the core that might facilitate moral learning. So things like, you know, preferring pro-social over antisocial others from really, really young infancy, I think 6 or 9 months. But a lot of what you're seeing in morality is going to be things that are shaped culturally, things that they learn from people around them. The unfortunate thing is it's just a really, really hard thing to get a clear answer on, because the best way to do that would basically be to either, you know, raise children in cultures that weren't their own and see how this shapes their morality or something like that, which isn't, you know, a feasible or ethical experiment. Or you can try to look at how this cultural variability kind of patterns with different moral judgments. And we know there's a huge amount of cultural variability in people's moral judgments in general. But it's just not always clear, you know, what is learned and what is innate or very early emerging. And so I think the answer, unfortunately, is both. But if either of you disagree, I know that this isn't a settled question.
Charlie?
No, I think the answer is absolutely both. Just like any attitude or value we might hold, there's a certain component of it that would be heritable. So it's you know, we can't say that isn't the case. As a social psychologist, I guess I'm more interested in the extent to which they are learnt, and the things that shape these as we get older. And just the impact of things like norms on these behaviours, which is massive. But yeah, if we're going for is it one or the other? It's both.
Yes, yes. I mean, I can't help but think, and I don't know if now is the right time to bring this work up, but I can't help but think of how the work that's being done, looking at the pattern of moral expansiveness between those who I think in the study were considered meat eaters or vegans, or was it vegetarians? I can't quite remember. Do you remember that it had a really cool title of the study?
Oh,
Do you remember the name of that one?
are you talking about tree huggers versus human lovers?
That was it. Was that the title? The tree huggers versus
Such a
human huggers.
fantastic paper. I make all my students read that work.
Oh well, Maddie, this study was obviously more familiar to you
No,
than what I can remember. What did they find again in that?
I mean, Charlie, it's yours. Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it. So this work was led by Josh Rotman, who's a fantastic researcher out at Franklin and Marshall in the US. And yeah, so in previous studies, we've really seen this typical pattern. As I said, people in adults, we tend to value humans over non-humans, but not everyone does. There are some people that tend to value non-human animals more so than human outgroups. And that's just a fascinating idea. And so yeah, I mean, I guess when you've got something like that, the big question is why? What separates these people? And so yeah, it's if anyone would like to read it, I definitely recommend you have a look at Tree Huggers versus Human Lovers, because we don't see this standard pattern. People do vary in the extent to which they express concern, and some people are absolutely more concerned about animals than they are about humans.
Does the same extend to the and this is a question from Meg. Meg has asked, is it the same to the wider natural world? So I'm thinking here in regards to plants and perhaps water and all of the other natural elements that make up our world.
Maddie, do you remember what we looked at?
So in the developmental study, we had sort of a rose bush, and we had an apple tree, and we had I think some objects, but I think mostly it was just the rose bush and the apple tree for plants. So I was going to say, I haven't done any work on this, but I know Carrie Neldner at UWA is currently working with some collaborators, I think with Mark Nielsen as well, is currently working on looking at moral consideration for the natural world. And so this seems to be something that I think will be coming soon. But most of the work that I'm aware of has really focused pretty much on animals at the moment, rather than explicitly on the natural world, with the exception of, within the moral circle having a few of these natural environment entities. And I know within that there was a little bit of variability too, right? So things like a redwood forest, which is kind of is going to differ from something like an apple tree, which I think intuitively can kind of feel a little bit different. A redwood forest is much older. It probably has more sentiment and meaning to a lot of people. And so I think people grant more moral consideration there, which I think raises, and forgive me if I'm derailing too far here, please feel free to bring me back around, but it raises this really interesting question of like what we actually mean when we're talking about moral concern and moral consideration here. And this is something I've been trying to work on a little bit, where I'm trying to look at the literature and say, we're making all of these claims because, one study across different studies in the field of moral consideration, where one study will use a ranking task and one study will use a rating task, and one study will ask about moral consideration and one study will ask about moral obligation. And we don't actually know that people are responding to these things in the same way. And I know Charlie has a little bit of ongoing work trying to tease some of these things apart. And I've also got a little bit of really early stage work where I'm just trying to say, like, what's actually going on out there in the field. But I think it's an important question, because the kind of moral consideration, for example, that you have. So an example that I think characterizes this reasonably nicely is that we generally, as adults, we know that we grant more moral consideration to human life than we do to animal life. But I think, so if we think about that maybe as moral concern, but if we think about kind of the obligation that we have, for example, to our dog versus a homeless person on the street, I think people would think it was more morally wrong to not feed your dog because you have this obligation to your dog than to not provide food to a homeless person on the street, who we generally seem to think that we have less obligation to. And so breaking down the kind of moral consideration that we're thinking about is also, I think, an important part of this question.
Very much so. It becomes pretty complex pretty quickly when you start to bring in some of that that interaction there between consideration, obligation, and however else way we're wording, these questions, trying to understand this area. Charlie, I'm kind of pivoting on a little bit, but connected to what Maddie was saying, are you doing any work at the moment that you find super exciting, that's really important for us to kind of know about in regards to moral expansiveness?
I mean, I think there's still so many questions that we need to explore. I think, James, following on from the work that we've done looking at linking compassion and moral expansion, which is still just really fascinating, in my opinion, and just finding that we can actually train people to be more compassionate, which then subsequently can increase their levels of moral expansion. But I think an interesting question that then arises is why? What is actually changing in people? So in psych research, we'd call that the underlying mechanism. Why are people who have this increased training in compassion actually then reporting an increased, say, moral obligation to care for others? So I think that's a really important link that we're trying to examine now. And also just so the second part of this question is not at all sexy. It's a really boring answer. But it's examining the impact of norms.
Right.
So just from a group perspective, the impact. I mean, we know that the norms in our cultures and the groups we exist in massively influence our behaviors and our attitudes. So one possibility is, can we instill more compassionate norms at the group level? So we as compassionate people, and if you can do that, does that change the norm at the group level and lead to greater moral expansion overall? So those are, I guess, the two questions that I'm most interested in at the moment.
I mean, that's just awesome. And as you were saying that, I couldn't help but think, and this might be silly, but often when people are completing that moral expansive scale and putting their entities in different areas of the bullseye to indicate how important they are or not so in terms of their moral concern, has that ever been done like as a group activity? Like, okay, here's 10 random people. We're going to put you together in the room, and you as a group of 10 have to come up with the answer on how these entities should land, and you're not allowed out of the room until you're happy with your answer that you're going to submit. Almost like it's a court, and the jury have to go out and they deliberate and they can't come back until they've got a verdict. Has that ever been done?
No, not to my knowledge. That is a very social psych experiment you've just described, James. And so that would be really interesting. One thing I would predict is, if you had this group, and if you quickly build a sense of connection and identity amongst the group, and you really emphasized that this group is a compassionate group. If you made that part of who they are, even really briefly, then I think, compared to a control group, what you'd see is this group would produce more expansive moral circles than a control. So that's something to test.
I mean, that'd be so cool I just love to watch it. I just love to watch how people would go about, explaining, justifying arguments, whatever, and how they come to resolution about where to put these entities. Anyways, I should just mention with that work, when I was reading your work, Charlie, was kind of a bit blown away. I thought it was just so fascinating and so central to the work I was doing with compassion. And, and a lot of the work I was doing with compassion was using imagery practices or other forms of intervention, maybe a meditation. And often I was looking at that in the context of mental health, often to help with things, regarding emotional pain. But also within, compassion is, this desire or wish to alleviate suffering of all sentient beings. I suppose the sentient part's there as it relates to different entities. But typically, if you were to follow a traditional kind of compassionate meditation, perhaps, you do focus a lot on this motivation, but also on the target, and you'll gradually look at working through the targets. So, you know, the targets might be somebody initially who you immediately, you know, who immediately makes you smile, someone you care about, someone you have perhaps even loving feelings towards, and then gradually expanding that to perhaps someone who's a stranger and someone you even dislike, and then, you know, gradually to groups of people, or all of humans throughout the world, which made me think, well, you know, given compassion is this kind of desire to see this suffering alleviated, and we will deliberately try to get people to think about how they could expand this to, particularly in those situations where there's been interpersonal difficulties, which can bring about mental health stress. So, you know, there can be really toxic relationships, I suppose. And it's kind of like, okay, how can we look at addressing that and do it in a way which is respectful, compassionate? And so it just made me think, well, if we were to do these compassion practices, would it ensue that the moral expansiveness would widen, even though we weren't doing that deliberately? We never talk about, you know, morality or anything like that explicitly, but we're just kind of like, let's see if we do this for 2 weeks and see if it does shift this moral expansiveness. And that's when you and I were collaborating together, and then we did that study, and we found we could initially in 2 weeks shift that kind of concern, but it was only for I think it was family and villains. Now, was it villains? Did villains make it at 2 weeks? I can't remember now, but I remember being pretty pumped with the villains finding. And it was also people we revered, you know, so people, you know, we kind of saw as being really important. Our moral concern became stronger for those 3 groups. But then 3 months down the line, when we assessed again, that kind of moral concern for all of those entity groups, animals included, environment, all of it increased, which we were, I mean, I was stoked with, because I think part of the idea was, you know, is this kind of, do you only have a certain amount of moral concern to throw around? Like, you know, if I give my moral concern, and moral concern might be tightly connected to resource. If I've only got so much of this to give, I want to make sure it goes to the people that I care about the most, perhaps. So there's some connection there in group. I can't give everyone the same amount of concern, so naturally it's going to wither away. So this idea that it's fixed, and as a result, some will have a lot and some will have a little. It was nice to perhaps have some kind of work to show that maybe it isn't as fixed as that, as like a zero-sum game. Maybe it can be more of a positive game where, no, we can start to look at this idea that it is something which hasn't got a set baseline. We can increase it. I mean, did you have any thoughts, or Maddie as well, any reactions to any of that?
I mean, I was very excited when I saw this paper, and I think it's the first paper I've ever seen that's actually manipulated and expanded people's moral circles through some kind of intervention. Maybe there's something else out there that I've missed, but I thought that was really, really fascinating. And so, yeah, thank you both for doing it.
Oh, Maddie, you're the best. What do you call it? I mean, I think, Charlie, you had been trying to do, you know, we had tried to do some work with like subtle inductions and stuff around security, I think. Is that right? We had look at doing some basic stuff, but you may have done more work.
I mean, there was some things that I think we really tried to, ways we tried to shift it. If we induce anxiety and fear in people, or a sense of their own mortality, would that reduce people's levels of moral expansion? But as you touched on earlier, what we were finding was that maybe in adults it was more of this fixed construct. That people just had their moral circles, and maybe they were really difficult to shift. And it wasn't until we really started exploring the links between compassion and moral expansiveness that it feels like we struck gold in that study. So yeah, I mean, just like you, I was pretty blown away when we saw that, and And I think it opens up a lot of interesting possibilities. That, as you said, we're not necessarily training people or getting them to focus on specific concern towards particular groups, or not telling them, hey, you should be concerned about these people in need or these environmental entities. It's just getting people to think in more compassionate ways and getting them to do that over time. And as a consequence, it seems like that might expand our moral circles, which it just is really, really fascinating. And we need to examine this more.
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I of course, was really enthusiastic about that, because it was like, okay, this opens up a lot of different possibilities about, okay, what was it within the intervention itself that really was a kind of a key process in helping expand that. And not that I've done any work on this at all, but one thing I get really interested in is, in the compassion framework we were using, one of the key elements was that was this focus on trying to de-shame a lot of lived experience. Like, a lot of us don't necessarily choose where we were born, what family we were born into. A lot of these things are decisions that were made without us here, and yet we come into this world, which might be a certain family with in a certain living arrangement or situation, which could be highly predictable, stable, loving, wonderful, but equally, just through the birth lottery, you could be in another environment where there's not a lot of that. There's a lot of conflict, perhaps no access to resource, and perhaps, fighting your way through things is the only kind of option in some ways to survive, really, in some ways. And so it kind of, I don't know, my part was like, kind of that may have helped a little bit with the villains, kind of, trying to create this kind of slight connection to, we are humans instead of this othering kind of element. We just happen to find ourselves here in this crazy world, trying the best we can in this flow of life. And there are, sure, there's an element of your own agency that you do have control over, but there's a lot of other factors that we just have zero kind of control on, which start extremely young and can have ongoing life impacts. But I mean, so I'm really interested in that kind of element, just even that little bit of psychoeducation, as opposed to a committed, sustained practice. Would that have any impact? I mean, the other thing that immediately springs to mind as well is whether or not those that are considered like meditative experts, so you could take like a monastic monk or something like that, if they were to do these moral expanse in the scale, would they just have these enormous circles? I would think so, but I don't know.
I mean, I think that's another interesting study, James. We should all...
really just a brainstorming session.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right. I mean, I feel like I've rambled a little bit there, but did anything come up there that either of you wanted to ask or comment on or add to?
I mean, I think I just say quickly that I absolutely agree. I think what that really offers is a chance of unique perspective taking that perhaps we don't often allow ourselves to engage in, and I think it can be a really powerful tool for extending or understanding other people's circumstances and extending concern as a result.
I think it also...
Maddie. Oh yeah, sorry.
Just very briefly, it kind of raises not that specific point, although that is, I very much agree with, and I think it's a really nice consideration, but the fact that you were able to sort of increase moral consideration across multiple categories, for me, also raises this, it's a point that I think it comes up a lot, where people will say, well, why do you care about animals when there's human suffering? And moral consideration is always presented as a trade-off. And I think, to me, the literature is pretty mixed on whether one moral consideration from one being is related to moral consideration for another. Like, is it that if you care more about human outgroups, you'll also care more about non-human animals, things like that. But seeing something like that suggests that, it can be, let's care more all around. And of course, you still have, physical resource limits and emotional resource limits. But I think it's a really nice message that caring more can lead to caring more in this kind of context.
Well, and as you were bringing up earlier, it could be that we can increase that moral expansiveness, but moral obligation might operate slightly differently in these instances as well. So we can increase. Yeah, generally I do care, and I've got more care for more people, but my sense of obligation towards these groups is perhaps still similar-ish. I'm not compelled to go out and give all of my resources to someone very distant from me. But I mean, that's one of the things I think I'm also keen to do. And Charlie, we've spoken about this, but this idea moving towards, if we had some kind of behavioral element where they could distribute some kind of resource or something, how would that shift across a period of time? If we were able to grow moral circles, how would that then look, in terms of behaviorally? Like, would we actually see something that we could pick up on? I mean, you might want some time to think about this, because I might throw to Maddie, because Maddie, you have looked at that to some degree with children, right?
We've done a little bit of it with children. So the project that Charlie and I were both on, we looked at whether children that were more morally expansive were more willing to donate resources. So this was the work led by Carrie Noldner and Charlie, that children who had more expansive moral circles were more willing to donate stickers to another child who was going to come into the museum later. But we actually didn't replicate that in the second study.
Really?
So yeah, we haven't found a particularly consistent relationship there. But I actually think it's kind of, to me, it feels like there's additional barriers to behavior that you don't get in moral consideration. So I imagine that somebody could be extremely, morally expansive, care really greatly about many, many different beings, but there can be a whole range of practical barriers that would prevent them from necessarily acting on that. So while I think that you're right, that increasing moral consideration will impact behavior, I think that there's you have to do a little bit extra to also get that behavioral change. So one thing that I've thought a lot about is that when you look at the field of the meat paradox, understanding how we can love animals but continue to eat meat, there's this messaging that comes through, which is, we want to get people to care about animals so they'll stop eating meat. But I think in some ways, if people were to stop eating meat, that would increase their moral consideration for animals, because you no longer have the behavior that you're doing that prevents you from extending that moral care. And so I wonder if, when we're thinking about moral expansiveness and behavior, we want to be a little bit more creative in terms of, as Charlie was saying earlier, about how can we actually break down these barriers in a way that allows us to expand our moral circles? And I think that if you can do that, both in terms of consideration, but also behaviorally, that'd be a really nice pairing. I have no concrete ideas of how to do it, but at least the abstract idea is there.
Fantastic point. Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. I think in the research that we do, if we can actually measure and see behavioral impacts, then that's really what we want to do. And it's not always easy to achieve. In the first moral expansiveness studies that we ran, we did include a behavioral component, and we found a link, which was nice. People were more willing to volunteer their time, if those who were more morally expansive. But yeah, I agree with what Manny just said. It's really if we can change people's attitudes, then that's really step one.
Yeah.
And then that's an important step. But I think having I guess societies where then people are able and willing to extend concern. But, if we live in more equal societies, that cross-cultural paper we examined, one of the main predictors of reduced moral expansiveness was the more unequal societies were.
Yeah.
So if we're in these contexts where we are living in equal societies and people can generally get by, then I think finding that link between shifting attitudes and then shifting actual behavior would be much easier to predict.
That's that element of inequality, and we know in a lot of Western cultures and societies, that gap between those who have lots and those who have not got a lot is widening. But does it matter what domain that level of inequality is? Because there's so many different forms of inequality, I suppose. When we talk about inequality, are you talking mostly about, Charlie, the work that's been done that's looked at kind of wealth in terms of inequality, or is it other forms of inequality also impact that moral expansiveness?
I mean, I think other forms of inequality might. The work I'm talking about has examined perceived wealth
Okay.
in
Yeah.
equality. So more so than actual levels of inequality that might exist, just the
Oh, wow.
perception
Yeah.
that we live
Yeah.
in a society that is unequal
Yeah.
was associated with more
Narrow.
restrictive moral boundaries.
Okay. Well, what was the number? Do you remember the top country with moral expansiveness? I mean, it's a bit of a crude kind of, I suppose, measure maybe or something. But do you remember what the number one country was?
This could be completely off the mark. I've got it. I'm thinking maybe it was French Canadians.
Oh, really? Wow.
That had the highest.
Oh, good
but
on you, French Canadians.
I mean, I can try and find it. Let's see.
Where did Australia land? I mean, this sounds like a very self-interested question because I'm from Australia. where did I mean? Given we do have I think there's a large degree of perceived inequality, we would be much lower.
Yeah, we weren't super high. I think
Look at this
we
on
were
the flight, Charlie, doing the work. You're a legend.
we were around the midpoint, but yeah, let me see if I can find it. So yeah, the highest moral expansiveness was people in Canada who speak French. Then we had Turkey, Poland, Germany, Spain, Malaysia, Brazil, Chile. Australia was towards the bottom.
Oh no.
But I mean, it's important to keep in mind we're not talking about large differences here. But yeah, we did see variations, and yeah, the most reliable thing that we saw that predicted these differences was perceptions that society is not equal.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's so important for us to consider if we're wanting to look at levers we can pull in order to help grow and get people in this kind of moral growth mindset, if you will. Addressing that inequality is critical. Maddie, there's a question here from Meg. Could you repeat the two scholars you mentioned who were researching moral consideration of the natural world?
Yeah, so that was Carrie Neldner at UWA, and I believe Mark Nielsen at the University of Queensland as well. But to my knowledge, like the research isn't finished yet. I think it's ongoing, but I'm sure if you reached out to Carrie, she'd be able to give you some insight on where things are at.
So that's Nelder, Neldner.
Yeah.
University of Western Australia, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Nielsen, Mark Nielsen at Nielsen at University of Queensland. And Matty, oh yeah, go Charlie.
I just wanted to jump in there quickly. I mean, most of the original work that we did include concern towards elements of the natural world. So it wasn't just animals. So yeah, if you are interested and want to look at some of that early stuff, you will find work examining moral consideration for the environment as well. But sorry.
Yeah. No, no, awesome. Thank you, Charlie. And a question here from Andy. What are some of the challenges you face when working with teenagers, and why do you think moral expansiveness dropped off in this population? Andy might not have teenagers. I'm just kidding. I should make a guess. I mean, beautiful teenagers, which is fantastic.
That's actually pretty spot on. So teenagers are not all teenagers. I don't want to generalize too widely here, but in general, they're not that excited to participate in research. So when you're working with sort of 5 to 10-year-old kids, we'll often test, for example, here in Edinburgh, I tend to go to the zoo and we test kids that are out with their families at the zoo, and we give them sort of little science toys at the end for participating, and they're really excited. And for the most part, they seem to really enjoy it. They're often also with their parents, and we of course can't test any person under the age of 18 unless they have parental permission, or it's 16 in some cases. But basically, it's really hard to get access to them. It's quite hard to get into schools. And then also, yeah, they're not as excited about participating. They don't like my science toys as much, very unfortunately. So it really is just a challenging group to engage with. And I don't know confidently that moral expansiveness has dropped off. So there's a little bit of work from Luke Maguire, who's a lecturer at Exeter, who seems to find lower moral consideration for animals in teenagers. But I haven't finished analyzing the data in our current work. If we do find the same pattern, then my guess is it's teenagers are kind of, going through a lot of changes. In general, that's sort of the times where they're going to act out, and they're going to sometimes, I certainly wasn't a great teenager. Sometimes I have to apologize to my mum for how I was when I was a teenager. And I think that maybe at that point, you're kind of quite self-focused, and you're not going to be really thinking in this abstract way about who you're going to grant moral consideration to. But at this stage, we just really don't know, and we need to do a lot more work to try and understand what the factors are that might be predicting if we do see this pattern, this restriction of the moral circle through the teenage years.
And I guess that speaks to, that idea that, we showed at least once, we need to replicate that we could grow, moral expansiveness. And we showed that it took some time, like, at 2 weeks, we could grow it for a couple of entity groups. But our kind of thought was, as you start to sit with some of these ideas, such as compassion and extending this, it might take a while for it to kind of filter through. Sometimes when your belief system or way of engaging with the world, your kind of immediate kind of, schemas, if you will, a kind of challenge, that could even lead you to go more defensive and go, no, I'm definitely not. So it might take a little bit of time to warm into it, as they say, sit with it. And then there's kind of like this sort of sleeper effect that kind of emerges, where actually, the more time I'm with this idea of extending it, the more it kind of, resonates perhaps. And I'm kind of motivated to engage. But I mean, we saw at 3 months that increase, but whether or not that maintains 12 months down the line, and how much, 5 years down the line, and how much that's dependent on keeping sort of an active, ongoing practice, or deliberately getting some dose of something, whether it be through an exercise, meditation, or people around you, or a norm, or some kind of thing being kind of highlighted or kind of coming in. There's a sense that for me it will grow, but then boom, shrink back again, after 6 months. Any thoughts on that? Like the ability to sustain this new baseline, if you will?
I mean, yeah, that's another tough question. I think part of the reason why we might have not seen it straight away is that people tend to be stubborn. It's just part of human nature. We know that when it comes to, especially attitudes and values that we hold with some sort of moral significance, or even more stubborn about those, we don't like to be challenged on these things.
Yeah.
So I think that in part comes into it. So in terms of, how do we sustain this over time? Well, the first question is, yes, we need to test it to see how long do these very brief interventions actually last. But I think also if we're talking about sustainable change, it's about really making that change the norm.
Yeah.
So if we're really concerned and as a society, or if we want to push our moral boundaries outwards, then we need to value that as an ideal, and as an expectation. And I think that's, if we can do that, if we see that from our leaders, from our politicians, I think that's probably the best chance that we have of seeing it sustained over time.
Yeah, that's bloody awesome, Charlie. I mean, and that kind of with the time we've got left, and which isn't much, I kind of wanted to. I think that's a wonderful kind of a segue into any final thoughts or comments around this concept of moral expansiveness. And I think the challenge we had was this humanity's greatest hope. Like, are there any final thoughts on that, Maddie and Charlie?
I guess I think it's a really hard question, right? I completely agree with Charlie. I think that having this individual level change, what can we do to increase individuals' moral circles, is really important. Some other work that I'm looking at that we've touched on the ideas around a little bit has been, when we have people who are raised in a particular environment with this particular set of beliefs, and then they end up kind of eschewing those beliefs and doing something that's particularly expansive or particularly compassionate. And I find that really interesting. So I've been working with kids who are raised in meat-eating households but who choose to become vegetarian, and also people who've sort of taken a pledge to donate portions of their income to effective charity, things like that, and trying to understand what's different about them. And that might give us some insight as well into, what are the, at least for these people, what are the mechanisms or the facilitators that can motivate that. But I think that while all this individual level work is really important, you two have both touched on this several times, it is really important that that is facilitated and supported sort of socially and culturally as well. If we think about, something like getting people to care about climate change. I remember, how many years ago it was sort of a thing of like, oh, do you believe climate change is human focused, or do you believe in climate change? And that question doesn't typically get asked that often anymore, because most people believe in climate change because there's been this social norm change. We've heard from leaders, we've heard from all the people that kind of give us information that this is real and important. And I think Charlie's exactly right, that if we could do something similar with expanding our moral circles and using our compassion and applying it more widely, then that's the kind of social shift that you might see as well. So basically just exactly what Charlie's already said.
No, I mean, yeah, we do need that help. It's not just, you can't just focus on individuals. Sure, important part of the picture, but trying to get the other factors to help just sustain it and support it and grow it to levels that an individual couldn't imagine is what's give us $10 million, someone out there, philanthropy, to let us do this work. That would be amazing. Charlie, any final thoughts from you before we wrap up?
I mean, I'd like to finish on you just asking people for $10 million. That's right. A nice place to finish. But I think, look, yeah, I think it's been said. I think, if we can train people on an individual level to be more compassionate, fantastic. That's a really cool thing. Maybe we can bring this into schools. Maybe we can bring this into workplaces, and that would be really great. But I think, if we want to see change sustained over time and on a broad scale, then it takes time, certainly, but it also takes structural change. So we need to see more equal societies. We need to expect more. I think from those in charge to really shift our expectations and the norms about what we can do as compassionate people living in compassionate societies. And I think if we do that, then I think we can be very hopeful indeed.
That is, yeah. Got little goosebumps. But no, that is absolutely it. Like, being committed to it, and often when we talk about compassion, having that sensitivity to suffering in self and others, and trying to alleviate and prevent it, being committed to that desire, that want, knowing there are going to be obstacles in the way, but you've got people around you and a society around you to help in continued support of that endeavor is so critically important. I mean, personally, just myself, through being connected with you both and reading stories, reading books around this area and just reading about other people's stories about their kind of work and things like the Global Compassion Coalition or effective altruism and all of this stuff. You just kept reading. Then all of a sudden I've shifted from meat eater into vegetarian. I haven't kind of gone vegan yet, but being raised in a family where that just would never have been the case, it's just okay. You keep reading and you feel like I'm part of this group, and then like the norms kind of are kicking in, and all of a sudden my behaviors are starting to change, and it just happens so easily through just reading. I mean, the power of story is so amazing, yet the story that we get sold constantly is fear, scarcity, etc., which is really problematic. Yet there is just so much remarkable work being done, which is so amazing what the Global Compassion Coalition does in trying to promote, through its work and its coalition, all the amazing work being done throughout the world, trying to create a world with more quality, with more opportunity, with more compassion. But on that, I noticed the hour is up. Thank you so much, Charlie and Maddie. You're both just fantastic researchers and people, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us all here today. We're extremely grateful, and thank you to everyone for the questions that came through during the discussion. We're very appreciative of that. if you're interested in anything further, do look up Charlie Crimson or Maddie Wilkes and their long line of research. And also, I do check out the Global Compassion Coalition website for further information as well. But otherwise, have a wonderful day. Bring compassion into your lives and grow your circles. Thank you very much for having us, James. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Maddie.